My daughter-in-law slept with my husband days before our divorce was finalized. I knew, and I still served them pie. The cinnamon clung to my sleeves. My hands didn't shake when I set the plates. Gerald asked for extra cream. Dana laughed like I didn't exist. The pie was still warm. I was not. Our lake house had gone silent these past few years, except for the loons and the furnace kicking on. But that day, it felt loud. Loud in the way betrayal always is, even when no one's shouting. I'd seen the porch camera footage 3 nights before. Dana stepping in through the back, hair still wet. Gerald opening the door. No words. Just the kind of silence that says too much. I watched the whole thing twice. Then I poured myself a glass of sherry and folded their laundry. Folks say Vermont Octobers are heaven. They never mention the wind that cuts right through your ribs. Gerald and I were supposed to finalize things next week, 45 years of marriage. Just folded up like last season's linens. Dana was staying just a few days, she said, until she could find her footing. I gave her the attic. My mistake. But I wanted to see if what I felt was real. If the whispers in the hallway and the double-washed dishes meant what I thought they meant. They did. When Dana asked for more whipped cream, I smiled and passed it. When Gerald complimented the crust, I thanked him. When they both left the kitchen to take a walk by the lake, I excused myself and went upstairs to print the deed, the original deed, the one my father filed in 1962, the one with the clause about bloodlines. It sat in my drawer for years. Now it was in my purse. I didn't cry, not because it didn't hurt, but because I needed my eyes clear. Vision sharp, timing clean. Some folks fight back loud, others wait. I've always believed silence can be sharper than screaming. And I was about to show them just how sharp. If your daughter-in-law betrayed you, would you say something, or would you serve the pie first? The first time we stepped into this lake house, the floorboards groaned beneath our boots. It was October 1976. Early frost still kissed the windows, and the wind off the lake carried the scent of cedar and chimney smoke. Gerald wore a red flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up, a pencil behind his ear. He looked younger back then, his jaw still lean, his hands calloused from honest work. I remember how he tilted his head, staring at the cracked window pane, like it was a math problem he couldn't quite solve. "You sure?" he asked, voice low. "She's old, pipes rattle like bones." "She's solid," I said, placing a hand on the hearth. "And so are we." I believed that, believed in us like folks believe in fall rain and long marriages. We painted the kitchen walls cream that weekend. Gerald did slow, careful strokes while I sang along to the radio, off key and happy. There was nothing in the cupboards but saltines and a jar of mustard. But we didn't care. We ate on the floor. Blankets wrapped around our shoulders, sharing a tin plate of leftover roast. I baked my first pie in that kitchen the next morning. The oven didn't heat right, and the crust burned a little, but Gerald still said it was the best thing he'd ever tasted. That pie mattered. Because we mattered, we scrubbed and patched and polished every inch of that house together. One faucet leak at a time. One stubborn drawer after another. And I loved it. Not because it was perfect, but because it was ours. That winter, I got pregnant with Caleb. We marked his growth on the kitchen doorway, one pencil line at a time. We drank cider in the evenings and watched the lake go still under the snow. Gerald held my feet under the covers. He brought me hot tea when I cried after Caleb's fever. He was kind once. There was tenderness in him, buried beneath his ambition, his quiet temper. But kindness fades slow, like smoke curling out of a candle stub. He stopped noticing the pie. Then stopped asking for seconds. Then stopped asking. The walls are still cream, but they don't shine the same. Dana sits at our table now, smiling like she owns the place. She says things like, "We should redo the cabinets." But she wasn't there in '76. She didn't scrub those floors with vinegar and lemon peels. She didn't labor over a crib in the living room because the nursery was too cold. I did. And I remember everything, even what they've forgotten. The first Christmas Gerald missed, he said it was a deposition in Albany. Just one day, he promised over the phone. Save me some cranberry sauce. I sliced the turkey alone that year. Caleb was 7, still young enough to believe Santa might knock if the chimney was clogged. I set the table for 3 anyway. His plate stayed warm, his chair untouched. I told myself not to mind. Lawyers are busy. Justice doesn't pause for holidays. But the years kept piling. There was always a conference, a client crisis, or a case that couldn't wait. And I kept lighting the fireplace alone. Kept folding his sweaters. Kept making apple pie because that's what I'd always done. Routine has a way of disguising loneliness. Some nights, Caleb would ask, "When's Dad coming home?" I'd smile too quickly. "Soon, sweetheart. He's working hard for us." That word used to mean something. Now it just echoed around an empty hallway. I remember one Thanksgiving. I'd been up since 5, basting the turkey, making my mother's stuffing from scratch. Caleb helped stir the mashed potatoes. He was 12, awkward and lanky, full of questions about the pilgrims. At 3 p.m., Gerald called. He wasn't coming. He didn't sound sorry. That was the first time I cried with the oven still running. I let the turkey dry out. I told Caleb I was just tired. Even then, I defended the man, made excuses for the distance, told myself it was temporary, a phase, something that would mend. But some things don't mend. They just fade, until one day, you realize the touch you've been missing hasn't belonged to you in years. By the time Caleb was in college, the silence between Gerald and me had its own language. We could sit through an entire meal exchanging no more than 5 words. How was work? Long. Dinner's in the oven. Thanks. I used to dream about retiring somewhere warm. Arizona, maybe. Somewhere with citrus trees and bright kitchens. But Gerald loved the lake house. Said Vermont kept him grounded. So I stayed. I always stayed. Even when the holidays shrank to just me and a lukewarm pie. Even when I knew he wasn't calling from court. Even when Dana began appearing at family dinners again. Not as Caleb's ex-wife, but as something else. It didn't take genius to connect the dots, but it did take strength to pretend I hadn't. I wasn't ready then. Now, I am. The photo on the mantel still shows us smiling. Gerald's arm around my shoulders. Caleb in the middle, cheeks smeared with cake. It was his 4th birthday. The year Gerald built the sandbox by hand. The year I stitched Caleb's pirate costume from scratch because the store, bought one, looked itchy. I dust that photo every week. They don't even glance at it anymore. Most of the frames are crooked now. One fell last month during a storm. I haven't had the heart to fix it. It cracked right across my face. Funny, how the house remembers everything when the people inside don't. There's still a dent on the pantry door where Caleb backed his tricycle too fast. Still faded crayon on the underside of the dining table. Caleb's secret, spaceship map, drawn during a boring dinner. I never wiped it off. Those marks meant we lived here. Loved here. Dana once called it outdated. "This house has good bones," she said, running her hand along the banister like it belonged to her. "But we could open up this whole floor. Knock that wall out. You'd be amazed." She was talking to Gerald. I was 10 feet away, slicing apples. They thought I didn't hear. They always think I don't hear. But I hear everything in this house. Every new perfume note. Every shift in his tone when he says her name. Every scrape of her chair pulled closer to his. Every laugh they share that used to be mine. What Dana doesn't know is that I built this house more than he ever did. I stayed when pipes burst. I stayed when snow piled 5 feet high. I stayed when Gerald didn't. And now she wants my walls, my stove, my story. She can have his attention. She can have the evening walks and the inside jokes and the too loud laughter. But she will never have this house. Because this house knows me. Because this house remembers, and because somewhere in the back closet, behind old quilts and summer fans, sits a box marked, Reynolds, Trust, 1962. I kept it for Caleb. Now, I keep it for me. Let them laugh. Let them believe I'm just the quiet one in the corner. But I was here first. And I don't forget. "You really shouldn't be lifting that, Margot," Dana said, all sugar and pity. She was watching me carry the roast to the table. Same roast I'd been making since before she was born. I set it down without flinching. It's not that heavy. Well, she drawled, at your age, better safe than sorry. Gerald chuckled. Not loudly, just enough for me to hear. Like agreement hiding behind a sip of wine. I turned to carve the roast. The knife moved easily, but my hands felt cold. Dana passed the mashed potatoes to Gerald, skipping me entirely. I reached for them myself. The dish was hot, burned my palm a little, but I didn't let it show. Caleb was supposed to come. Said he had a late client call. But deep down, I wondered if he knew something. Wondered if he was staying away to not have to choose. Dana poured herself another glass of wine. You know, this place has so much potential, she said, glancing around the dining room. With just a little updating, it could feel more current. I didn't answer. Instead, I stared at the spot on the wall where Caleb's crayon map used to be, until Gerald painted over it. Dana kept talking, knocking out the pantry wall, opening this whole space. It would breathe. She smiled directly at me then. As long as we don't wait too long. These older places get tricky if left too long in one hand. One hand. She meant mine. I took a sip of cider. Let it settle. Let it speak louder than anything I could say. She didn't want the roast. She wanted the house. She wanted everything I held quietly for 45 years. And she thought she could get it by pretending I was already halfway gone. Gerald made a joke about the furnace needing replacing. Dana laughed like it was the cleverest thing she'd heard all week. My fork scraped the plate. I chewed slowly, counted backward from 10. I'd learned to survive winters in this house alone. Learned to patch a roof without waiting. Learned how to keep a fire alive all night long. Dana had no idea who she was smiling at. When dinner ended, she offered to help clear, but only gathered Gerald's plate and her own. Don't strain yourself, Margot, she called behind her. Let us handle the mess tonight. The roast sat half carved on the counter. I wrapped it, put it in the fridge. By myself, the dishwasher clicked shut. Her laughter drifted from the hallway. Their bedroom door closed softly, hers now, not mine. I stood alone in my kitchen, hands wet, heart dry. I didn't cry. I'd already done that. Now I was listening, and I was making a list, not of groceries, not of chores, but of names, dates, moments. I didn't know when I'd use them, but I would. I was clipping lavender from the front garden when I heard Dana's voice drift across the fence. Oh, it's such a lovely home, she said, all smiles. But, it's a lot for Margot these days. She was speaking to Mrs. Lafferty, our neighbor from 2 houses down, the one who brings over lemon bars when she forgets someone's birthday. Of course, Mrs. Lafferty said, nodding politely. Old houses do take work. Dana leaned closer. We've been talking about downsizing, she added. Somewhere quieter, safer. Less to manage. I held the shears tighter. Dana had never painted a wall here. Never fixed the screen door when the latch went loose. Never sealed the windows before the frost came. But there she was, rehearsing a future I hadn't signed off on. When she spotted me near the rosebush, she waved. Like nothing had happened.
Morning, Margot.
Your lavender's gorgeous this year. I nodded once. Said nothing. Later that afternoon, I noticed a brochure tucked under a cookbook on the counter. Seasons of Autumn, Independent Senior, Living with Dignity. The irony nearly made me laugh. Gerald had written something in the margin. A number. Circled. He hadn't even tried to hide it. That night, I watched them from the hallway. Dana on the couch, curled up with a blanket I knitted. Gerald beside her, sipping scotch from my anniversary glass. She tilted her head and said something. He smiled. They clinked glasses like co-conspirators. My wedding ring sat in the jewelry box upstairs. Not on my finger. The next morning I made scones. Set the table for 3, again. Neither of them came down. By the time I poured my second cup of tea, the scones had gone cold. I scraped the bottoms into the compost. Folded the napkins back into the drawer. In the quiet, I walked upstairs and opened the cedar chest. Inside were 3 things: my wedding dress, the deed from 1962, and a manila envelope labeled TRUST BODEC. I ran my fingers along the edge of the paper. The ink was slightly faded, but the intent was not. Property to remain within the Reynolds bloodline. No exceptions. I closed the chest. Downstairs, Dana's laughter echoed from the patio. A knife, edge kind of joy. She thought she was winning. She thought I was done. But I've lived through longer winters than this. And I've buried deeper wounds under quieter soil. It started with a missing checkbook. I wasn't looking for it, really. Just sorting through the kitchen drawer. The one stuffed with takeout menace, dead batteries, and warranty papers from appliances we no longer owned. But it was gone. Our joint account ledger, the one I used to balance each month with a cup of chamomile and a pencil sharpened to a fine point. So I logged into the bank portal instead. I hadn't in weeks. Gerald usually handled it these days. Ever since he retired, he'd insisted it was simpler that way. What I saw made my stomach sink. Tiny withdrawals. 120 here, or 85 there. A recurring charge from a landscaping service we hadn't used in years. A new line item labeled EMR Partners LLC. Unfamiliar, vague. Over $3,000 gone in 5 weeks. I stared at the screen, blinking slowly. My tea went cold beside me. These weren't emergencies. These were deliberate. I printed the last 2 statements and placed them in the cedar box with the trust papers. Then, I went to wash the pie dish. It was still warm from breakfast. I had made cherry this time. Gerald liked cherry. The back door creaked open as I dried my hands. He stepped into the kitchen holding a yellow envelope. The kind realtors use. "Hey," he said. "Thought I'd catch you before your walk." I didn't answer. Just nodded. He laid the envelope gently on the counter like it was a favor. "Just some paperwork Patricia wants us to look over. You know, with things moving toward finalization." I wiped the edge of the counter again, though it was already clean. "What kind of paperwork?" "Just a property adjustment. Makes everything easier for probate, in case, anything happens down the line." I opened the envelope. It was a transfer form, requesting to move the lake house into his name alone, citing financial restructuring. I looked up. "Probate," I said softly. "You expecting me to die soon?" He chuckled. That chuckle again. No. It's just precaution." "Standard stuff." I slid the papers back into the envelope. "Let me think on it," I said, my voice even. "Sure," he said, kissing my cheek like a man not stealing my life. After he left, I sat down at the table, placed the envelope beside my tea, and stared at both like they might talk back. I'd given that man 5 years, 1 child, 1 house, every second helping him build the life he said he wanted. And now he wanted it all on paper. Without me. No signature. Not yet. I tucked the envelope under the drawer with the saltines. I would not be erased that easily. Dana found me in the garden the next morning. I was kneeling in the soil, coaxing life from a row of tired mums. The lake breeze was crisp, sharp enough to remind me that winter was closer than it looked. "Need a hand?" she asked, stepping down the porch steps in suede boots far too clean for dirt. I shook my head. These old hands still work. She crouched beside me anyway, watching as I pruned the dead petals. "Gerald mentioned he gave you the paperwork." I didn't look at her. Just kept clipping. "He's only thinking ahead, making things easier. For everyone." I pulled a weed. "Everyone," I repeated. She smiled, soft and polished. "You deserve peace, Margot. Less stress. Taxes, maintenance, all that. It's too much." I looked at her then. No apron. No dirt under her nails. No memory in her eyes of what it took to keep this house standing through 40 Vermont winters. "Has Gerald ever told you how many times this porch flooded before we installed the trench drains?" She blinked. "No, I stood slowly, brushing soil from my knees. "I stayed through every one. With towels and buckets." Dana's mouth twitched. "Just a little." "Well," she said, rising to her feet. "That's why you deserve to rest now. To let go. This place is beautiful, but it's not a burden you have to carry forever." I nodded. "You're right. It's not." She tilted her head. So you'll sign. I didn't answer. Instead, I wiped my hands on my gardening towel, walked past her into the house, and shut the door. I waited until I heard her heels clicking back up the porch before I moved. Upstairs, in the old sewing room, I unlocked the drawer where I kept my father's briefcase. Inside was a dusty Rolodex, stiff with age. I flipped through until I found the card, handwritten in green ink. Patricia Chen, Estate and Trusts, Boston Des. We'd met once, years ago, at a conference Gerald skipped. She was sharp then. I hope she still was. I dialed the number slowly, letting the rotary clicks settle into the silence. Shen and Associates. A woman answered. Patricia, please. May I ask who's calling? She'll remember. Margot Reynolds. From Vermont. Tell her, the Reynolds Trust just woke up. A pause. One moment. The line clicked. Then a familiar voice. Margot. My God, it's been too long, I said. I need your help. Of course. What's going on? I looked out the window at Dana. She was laughing into her phone, tossing her hair like she owned the whole sky. They want my house, I said quietly. But I've still got the deed. Another pause. A different kind. Come down, Patricia said. Bring everything. We'll take it from there. I hung up, folded the envelope, slipped the deed into my coat pocket. Let them play their game. Mine had just begun. Boston felt too fast, even in October, with leaves like fire in the trees and coffee carts on every corner. It made my Vermont bones ache a little. But I needed the ache. It meant I was doing something. Patricia's office was on the 12th floor of a glass building near the harbor. Polished. Clean. But warm somehow. Not the kind of place where old women got talked down to. She met me in the lobby herself. Margot, she said, pulling me into a soft hug. Still remember how you liked your tea. I smiled. Black, no sugar. Strong, like always. Her office overlooked the water. The blinds were half drawn, letting in streaks of gold and gray. She poured the tea herself, no assistant in sight. Tell me everything, she said. So I did. Not just about the trust, but the pie, the silences, the stolen laughter echoing through walls I once painted with my bare hands. She listened without blinking. Took notes in pen. Let silence hang in the air when it needed to. When I finished, she leaned back and opened the manila folder I'd carried like a shield. I watched her read the original trust deed, the clause my father had insisted on in 1962. He'd been wary even then, about second marriages, about inheritance misunderstandings. Her brows lifted slightly. Well, she said, who was smart, protective, and specific. She slid the document toward me and tapped one line with her finger. In the event of dissolution of marriage due to infidelity, the properties listed shall remain under the sole stewardship of the Reynolds bloodline. I felt the heat rise in my chest. Not anger. Not sadness. Validation. So Gerald can't take the house, I asked. Patricia shook her head. Not only can't he take it, he can't even transfer it. That attempted adjustment. Legally meaningless. I swallowed hard. What about Dana? She's not family, Patricia said simply. Not by blood. Not anymore. I exhaled for what felt like the first time in weeks. All those nights pretending not to know. All those meals I cooked with steady hands while they whispered down the hall. I hadn't been crazy. I'd been patient. This isn't just about the house, I said quietly. It's about not disappearing. Patricia nodded. Then let's make sure you don't. She handed me a new folder, neatly labeled, color-coded tabs. Here's what we'll do. Quietly. Legally. By the time they realize what's happened, you'll already have every document filed. I took it in my hands. It was heavier than I expected, and steadier. Thank you, I said. Don't thank me yet, she replied. Let's get to work. Outside, the harbor wind pressed against the windows. But inside, for the first time in a long while, I felt unshakable. The train back from Boston pulled into the station just past dusk. I stepped onto the platform with the manila folder zipped inside my canvas tote, every tab labeled, every page reviewed 3 times. The wind off the hills carried the sharp bite of wood smoke and dying leaves. Vermont was colder now. But I wasn't. By the time I reached the lake house, the windows glowed gold again. Dana had left the porch lights on, probably for herself, not for me. Inside, I moved quietly. I didn't want to answer questions. Not yet. I took the folder upstairs to the guest room closet, the one Gerald hadn't stepped into in years, and pulled out the small fireproof lockbox I used to keep Caleb's birth certificate and a few old savings bonds. The key still worked. I tucked the folder inside, along with the printed bank statements and a flash drive Patricia gave me, just in case. Then I locked it, slid it under a stack of flannel sheets, buried it with the quiet precision of a woman who had learned how to keep things safe and silent. I was coming back down the stairs when I heard a knock at the side door. Not the front, never the front. Only family used the side. I opened it, and there stood Wade. Tired eyes, hands in jacket pockets, a box of takeout balanced on one arm. "Hope it's not too late," he said. "Figured you might not have eaten." "I haven't," I replied, surprised at how steady I sounded. He stepped inside, glancing around. "Dad home?" "No," I said. "He and Dana went to some concert in Burlington." "Eh?" He set the box on the counter. "Thai place downtown. You still like yellow curry, right?" I nodded. We didn't speak for a full minute after that. Just the hum of the fridge and the clink of forks. Then he said it. "You look tired." "I'm not," I said. He studied me. Quiet. Searching. "You sure everything's okay?" I met his eyes. It would have been so easy to say no, to spill it all, to tell him about the trust, the bank account, the signatures Gerald had hoped to slip past me while Dana played hostess of a home she never built. But I didn't. "Not yet, I'm sure," I said. He exhaled and gave a small nod, like he wanted to believe me. After he left, I sat alone at the table for a long while. The curry had gone lukewarm. Outside, the lake reflected nothing but darkness. I walked the house one more time that night. Ran my fingers along the painted banister. Checked each window latch. Tightened the knob on the drawer Dana had started leaving open. And then I stood in the center of the living room, surrounded by silence, by memory, by ghosts and promises. The walls didn't creak. They listened, and I knew. They were waiting too. The invitations were subtle. Handwritten notes in pastel envelopes left on doorsteps, slipped into mailboxes. Dana said it was just a little thank you gathering. A way to welcome new energy into the lake house. She called it a transition. I wasn't asked. I was informed. By the time I came down from my room, the living room was filled with voices that didn't belong. Shoes on rugs I'd woven, fingers brushing vases I'd chosen. Dana wore a cream sweater dress and glossy lipstick. Gerald stood beside her, hand resting lightly on her back like muscle memory. I almost laughed. They looked like the ad in a retirement brochure, wealthy, rested, slightly bored. "Margot," Dana called from across the room. "There you are. I told everyone you'd make an appearance." Everyone turned to look. Mrs. Lafferty, Gerald's golf friends, even Helen Carrington, who once told me Dana was a bit too polished to trust. "Well," I said, smoothing my sleeves, "I do live here." A few people chuckled. Dana didn't. "Come join us," she said, holding out a glass of Prosecco. "We were just talking about change." I took the glass. Didn't drink. Gerald gave me that tired smile he reserves for strangers and judges. Dana turned to the group. "You know, when Gerald and I started discussing the future of this house, we realized it needed new breath, a fresh rhythm, something brighter." She looked at me then. "And Margot's been so gracious. Truly. Stepping back, letting us imagine what's next." The room shifted. Just slightly. The kind of shift that happens when someone drops a truth wrapped in lace, and everyone pretends not to notice the thud. I set the glass on the mantel. Behind me was the family photo from Caleb's 3rd birthday. They hadn't taken it down yet. "That's quite an assumption," I said softly. Dana tilted her head, all concern. "Oh, no offense meant. We just thought, with the changes happening, you'd want to slow down. Focus on yourself." Someone clinked a spoon against a glass. "Two's time." Gerald raised his drink. To new chapters, he said. To homes that grow with us. To letting go. Dana added, smiling at me. My hands tightened at my sides. The room blurred, not with tears, but with heat. That slow, crawling heat that comes when shame tries to find a place to settle. I nodded once. Didn't toast. Didn't speak. I simply stepped back into the hallway, heels muted against the carpet I picked out 32 years ago. In the kitchen, I stood alone. Dana's laughter spilled in from the next room. Someone made a joke about turning the den into a yoga studio. I opened the fridge. Closed it again. I wasn't hungry. I walked to the back door, slid it open, stepped outside. The lake was still, too still. I stood on the porch and let the silence fall over me like a quilt, and for one long minute, I let myself feel it. Not rage, not revenge, but absence, like being erased in slow motion, like watching your name fade from the deed of your own life. The air outside had turned colder. I stood on the back porch, arms folded, watching the lake swallow the last of the sun. The wind carried faint laughter from the living room. Dana's high and bright, Gerald's low and practiced. Footsteps creaked on the porch steps behind me. I didn't turn. You always did need a moment away from the noise, said a voice I hadn't heard in months. I turned slightly. Loretta May. Same blue coat she'd worn every fall since I can remember. White curls tucked under a knit hat. Her eyes, as usual, missed nothing. I didn't see you come in, I said. You looked occupied. She replied gently. We stood in silence for a beat. The kind of silence only two women of a certain age can share, layered with things not said. I remember. Loretta said, her voice soft, when this porch echoed with your laughter. You used to hum while sweeping. Gerald would chase Caleb with that ridiculous rubber snake. I smiled, but it didn't reach far. Now it's her housewarming party. Is it? She said. Funny. I don't recall seeing her here when you planted those lilacs. I huffed a breath. She says the house needs new energy. Loretta scoffed. Energy comes from the soul in the walls. And these walls remember you. We watched the water ripple, catching light from the windows behind us. I heard what she said. She added. I didn't ask which part. Loretta continued. Some folks like to pretend time started the day they arrived. But the rest of us, we remember. And memory's a powerful thing, dear. I turned to her. Her hand was warm when it found mine. Steady. You okay? She asked. No, I said. But I will be. She squeezed my fingers. Then, sensing it was enough, she stepped back toward the house. You coming in? She asked. I shook my head. Not yet. She nodded and disappeared inside. I stayed, let the chill find its way to my bones. Let the ache of displacement settle just enough to be real, but not enough to break me. When I finally turned back toward the house, I caught a glimpse of Dana through the window, laughing with a glass of wine, gesturing toward my bookshelves like they were stage props. And for the first time, I didn't flinch. I smiled, not politely, not with pain, but with precision. There's a kind of smile only women over 60 can wear. The one that says, I've been here longer than you, and I'll be here long after you're gone. I stepped back inside, quietly, purposefully. Let them toast transitions. Let them measure curtains. Because I had already started something far more permanent. And I wasn't done yet. If someone stood in your living room and erased your name with a smile, would you fight back? Or would you wait and let the house speak for you? Comment below. I found the envelope behind the microwave, tucked flat beneath the user manual for a blender we hadn't used in 5 years. Gerald must have thought I'd never look there, and maybe once I wouldn't have. But I was looking now. Inside 2 printouts, wire transfers, both dated within the last 10 days, each for just under $5,000, enough to avoid the bank's automatic reporting thresholds. Both to an entity called EMR Partners LC. Dowsex. No address, no invoice, just a name. I read it 3 times. EMR Dana's maiden name was Emery. I stared at the letters until they blurred. Then I folded the paper and slipped it into the same envelope as the property adjustment Gerald had tried to make me sign. The box under the flannel sheets was getting heavier. Downstairs, the dishwasher hummed. Dana had taken over the evening dishes lately. Not because she was kind. Because she liked standing at the sink, pretending she ran the place. Gerald would dry. She would direct. I would disappear into the wallpaper. But not tonight. Tonight, I stayed in my father's old office, the one we never updated. The wood paneling still smelled like tobacco and lemon oil. I opened the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet and pulled out the last of the old banking records, yellowed statements with fountain pen ink, receipts from the 60s, trust renewal notices, and then, at the very bottom, a photograph, black and white. My father and me. I was maybe 15. We were standing in front of the Rutland Savings and Loan, both in coats too heavy for fall. He'd just opened the Reynolds Trust. You keep the land, he'd said. Not just for you. For your children. And theirs. Back then, I'd barely understood what he meant. Now, I understood too well. I placed the photo beside the new bank statements. Past and present, father and daughter, ink and intent. They thought I'd roll over. They thought age made you slow, soft, forgetful. But age had only sharpened the line between what could be forgiven and what couldn't. EMR Partners. I picked up the phone and dialed Patricia's office. This is Rachel. Her assistant answered. Can I help? Tell Patricia I found a company. EMR Partners LLC. It's tied to recent transfers from our joint account. I need to know who's behind it. Rachel paused. Do you have the amounts? I do. 2 transfers. One on the 5th, one on the 12th. Both just under 5,000. Got it. I'll make sure she sees this. I hung up. Outside, Dana laughed again. Same cadence, same notes. Only this time, it didn't rattle me. It steadied me. I ran my fingers over the old bank letterhead in my lap and whispered, not to anyone in particular. They're not taking this house, Daddy. Not while my name was still Reynolds. The email came just before midnight. Subject EMR Partners Preliminary Findings. Faye from us Patricia Chen F. Margot. If we ran a business trace through our investigator, EMR Partners LLC is registered to a Delaware holding address, but the authorized signatory is listed as Dana Emery Clark, A. No co-signers. No employees, no actual operations. Yves, it's a shell, she's funneling money. I stared at the screen for a long while. Gerald's name wasn't on it. Not legally, but morally, he was neck deep. I didn't forward the email. Didn't print it. Instead, I let it sit, open, on the old laptop I kept in the sewing room, next to the drawer with the Rolodex and the receipts. Then I went downstairs to refill my tea. The house was dark, but not asleep. Their bedroom door was closed. A wedge of yellow light peeked from beneath. Shadows moved across the slit. Hers sharper, his slower. They were still awake. Still living out their little fantasy beneath my roof. As the kettle hissed, I walked past the printer in the hallway and saw a page still resting in the tray. Something Dana must have forgotten. A renovation estimate. 3 pages, letterhead from a boutique interior firm in Burlington. Paint samples, countertop options, and one highlighted section that stopped me cold like ours. Project title, Clark House Remodel, Ka Clark. Her name. Not mine. Not Reynolds. Not even Reynolds Clark. Just Clark. She was planning a full gut, bathrooms, pantry, kitchen walls. A sunroom addition where my father's office stood, and at the bottom, next to the signature line for client approval, were faint initials. DEC Dana Emery Clark. I flipped to the second page. Payment schedule. The deposit matched the transfer amount from the bank. She wasn't just stealing. She was laundering it through her dream kitchen, on paper. And Gerald either didn't care or didn't ask. I took the pages and placed them in a folder labeled State Trash. Just temporary, just to keep it moving. Then I walked to the foot of their bedroom door and stared. For longer than I should have. I could hear her voice, muffled and distant. Not laughter this time, but something worse, a lull. Comfort. Domesticity. She belonged here now, at least in their minds. But minds can be corrected. I turned and walked back to the kitchen, steeped my tea. Each motion slow, deliberate. I didn't tremble, didn't rage. I sat at the table and opened a blank page in my ledger, title, Address Dana timeline va EMR deposit 10 $5 lar EMR deposit antibother 12 remodel estimate printed $100 C 16 the Gerald handed transfer docs Hund housewarming party $100 20 Clark House blueprint 10 OC 21 every betrayal has a breadcrumb trail, and I was collecting it all. If Gerald had given Dana my house, my kitchen, my savings, he'd done it in the dark. Now, I would bring the light, and when I was finished, only one name would remain on that deed, and it wouldn't be Clark. The clock read 20:16 a.m. I was wide awake. The lake outside was still, a sheet of black glass reflecting nothing but the occasional blink of the porch light. I slipped from bed quietly, careful not to wake the floorboards, and padded down the hallway barefoot. In the kitchen, the kettle clicked off before I even touched it. I must have filled it out of habit earlier and forgotten. Strange. The things our hands remember when our hearts are tired. I poured myself a mug and leaned against the sink. The glow from the oven clock lit the room in green. And suddenly, I remembered. 10 years ago, same kitchen, same hour. Gerald had come in from the den, eyes tired, jaw unshaven. He was holding a manila envelope, something to do with the business. He set it on the counter, but instead of leaving, he stood there, staring out the same window I stared through now. Sometimes I think, he said, that this house is the only thing I've ever done right. I looked up from the dish I was drying. Not our son. He smiled. Well, him too. But this place, it's bones. It feels permanent. Then he added, quiet but firm, no one else will touch this house while I'm alive. It stays in the family. Always. I didn't reply. But I remembered the way he said it. With conviction, like it meant something. Now I stood in that same spot, hearing those same words echo against a very different man's decisions. Dana was making plans with Gerald's blessing. And he'd forgotten what permanence even meant. Or maybe it had never meant anything to him in the first place. I took another sip of tea. It was too hot, but I welcomed the burn. Then I walked to the desk in the corner of the room and pulled open the drawer where I kept the nice stationery. Cream paper, faint lines, gold trim. Caleb had given it to me one Christmas when he was 16. For when you finally write that book, he'd said. Tonight, it wouldn't be a book, but it would be a beginning. I uncapped my pen, wrote the date slowly in the corner, October 22, 2021, then paused. My hand hovered, steady as ever, because what I was about to write wasn't a letter, it was a record, and I wanted every word to count. October 26, 2021, Dear Caleb, I'm writing this on a quiet night. The house is still the way it used to be after you'd gone to bed. Back when your door was plastered with dinosaur stickers, and you called the pantry the snack cave. I can still hear the echo of your feet, running down the stairs on Christmas morning. Can still feel the weight of your head on my shoulder the first time your heart was broken. You've always been a good boy. Even now, grown, serious. Trying your best to do what's right. I see that. But there are things you don't see yet. Or maybe things you've chosen not to. That's why I'm writing this. Not to accuse. Not to plead. But to leave something behind that isn't twisted by someone else's voice. You once told me this house felt like a living thing, that it creaked in storms and sighed when you came home. You were right. This place holds more than wood and windows. It holds legacy. And legacy, Caleb, belongs to those who remember what it took to build. I want you to know that everything I've done, everything I'm about to do, is for that legacy, not just for me, but for you, for the child who once helped me grout the bathroom tile with his toy spatula, for the teenager who fixed the porch light without being asked, and maybe for the man who, one day, might come back to this place with his own child. You may hear things soon. You may be told I'm being difficult, that I'm holding on to the past, that I'm standing in the way of what's next. But next doesn't always mean better. And letting go isn't always the brave thing. Sometimes, staying rooted is the only way to survive a storm. I'm not asking you to choose. I'm asking you to remember where you come from, what we built, and who stood quietly in the background to make sure it stayed standing. With love, Mom. I folded the letter carefully, slipped it into one of the old blue envelopes Caleb used for pen, pal club in 4th grade. His handwriting still marked the corner. To Texas, from Vermont. Then I walked upstairs into his old room. Still smelled faintly of worn flannel and pine. The bookshelf was mostly empty now, but the bottom drawer of the desk still stuck the way it always did. I opened it slowly. Inside sat an old shoebox, cracked, scuffed, but familiar. I placed the letter inside, closed the lid, didn't lock it. Just let it rest. One day, he'd find it. And when he did, I hoped he'd understand I wasn't trying to win. I was trying to protect what was already his. Monday morning arrived with the kind of sunlight that flatters nothing. The lake looked pale. The dishes in the sink looked like they'd been waiting for an apology. I opened my laptop, typed slowly, deliberately. Each letter of the IRS portal address. Double, checking spelling like it was sacred. Patricia had walked me through the process the night before. Use the whistleblower link, she said. You're not accusing, just asking questions, quietly. So I did. I filled in the entity name, EMR Partners LLC. I uploaded the bank statements. Attached the renovation invoice Dana had left in the printer. Added a short note, possible misuse of joint marital funds, shell entity activity, recommend review of account holder D.E. Clark. I didn't sign my full name, just the followers Margot R., concerned spouse. After then, I logged into our joint account and submitted a request to freeze outgoing transfers over thousand, flagged for marital dispute protection, one of the features the bank's trust advisor had explained years ago. Gerald never used it, but I had taken the time to understand it. As I closed the laptop, I heard his footsteps behind me. Morning, he said, voice rough with sleep. You're up early. Hebit? I said, rinsing my teacup. He poured himself coffee, opened the fridge, and frowned. Where's the leftover roast? I packed it for the food pantry drop. They asked for cooked meals this week. He raised an eyebrow. Without asking me. I turned, slowly. Since when did you want leftovers? He didn't answer. Instead, he sat at the table with his coffee, staring into it like it might answer for him. After a moment, he spoke. You know, you've seemed distant lately. I tilted my head. Distant. He nodded. Tired. Pulled back. Not like yourself. I let the pause stretch. Then I smiled. Funny. I was just thinking the opposite. He looked up. What do you mean? I feel more awake now than I have in years. He blinked. I sipped my tea. I've started cleaning out old drawers. I added. Organizing. Looking at what needs keeping and what doesn't. He gave a short, nervous laugh. Well, we are moving toward change, I guess. I nodded. That we are. He didn't press further, and I didn't fill the silence. After breakfast, he disappeared into the study, likely to check his emails, review accounts. He'd find out soon enough. That transfers were bouncing. That someone was looking into Dana's company. That the house wasn't slipping from my fingers after all. Not easily. I walked into the living room, picked up the dust cloth, and ran it across the mantel. The family photo still sat there, Caleb's 4th birthday. Gerald holding him high, me laughing off frame. Dana wasn't in that picture. She never would be. And as of this morning, neither would her name, on any document that mattered. On let them sip coffee. Let them call me tired. Because I wasn't fading. I was sharpening. And the next move wasn't theirs anymore. The first sign that something had shifted came in the form of a slammed cabinet. Dana had been on the phone for 20 minutes, pacing between the kitchen and the mudroom, voice rising in sharp little bursts that she tried, and failed, to keep hushed. I don't understand, she snapped. You said the deposit went through last week. Pause. No, I'm not trying to blame you. I just... Look, I'll check on my end, but I was told this was handled. Another pause. A cabinet door banged shut. She muttered something under her breath and hung up. I continued slicing apples at the counter, letting the rhythm of the knife calm me. Dana turned. Did you touch the printer? I glanced up. No. She folded her arms. I printed a contract estimate yesterday. It's missing. Maybe Gerald moved it, I said. You know how he hates clutter. Her eyes narrowed. Right. As she opened the fridge, stared into it like it had betrayed her too. Then, has the internet been slow lately? Seems normal to me. I laid the sliced apples in a pan, added cinnamon, brown sugar, a pinch of salt. She watched me, silent. Searching. Something's going on, she finally said. I nodded. That does tend to happen in houses like this. She set a glass down too hard on the counter. Cut the act, Margot. I looked at her then. Really looked. The gloss was still there, hair, lips, nails. But the eyes were different now. Tate. Alert. Like a swimmer who's just realized the tide has shifted against her. I'm not acting, I said, brushing flour from my hands. I'm baking. Dana crossed her arms. The remodeling deposit bounced. My card got declined at the design consult, and Gerald says the bank flagged our account. I let out a soft as if she'd told me the weather looked gloomy. She stepped closer. What are you doing? I wiped my hands on the towel. Folded it neatly. Then I met her gaze. Reading the fine print. She blinked. What? The thing about living in a house like this for 45 years. I said calmly. As you learn every crack in the floorboards, every quirk in the wiring, every clause in the trust your father wrote by hand. Dana's lips parted, but no words came. I set the pie in the oven and closed the door gently. Then I straightened. You walked in here thinking I was furniture, I said. But furniture doesn't read contracts. And it doesn't sign them, either. Her face flushed. Gerald said you'd agreed. I raised an eyebrow. Gerald says a lot of things when he thinks no one's listening. She didn't speak. The silence was thick, awkward, twitching with questions. But I didn't fill it. I simply turned back to the counter and began cleaning up. Dana stood there a moment longer, caught between confusion and a kind of dread she hadn't yet learned to name. Then she stepped back, her heels clicking too hard against the tile, and walked out of the room. Not stomping, retreating. And for the first time in weeks, the kitchen felt like mine again. He came into the kitchen with the letter still in his hand. I could see it before he even spoke. The corner crumpled, the crease too sharp from being folded too fast. Patricia's return address at the top, bold and unmistakable. Gerald never crumpled letters unless they made him feel small. I was pouring tea. Black, no sugar. Care to explain this? He asked, holding it out like it was on fire. I didn't take it. I could, I said. But I think Patricia already did. He dropped it onto the table. It says the trust overrides marital ownership in the event of adultery. I nodded. It does. His mouth tightened. That clause hasn't been enforced in decades. No court will take it seriously. Yet here we are, I said, setting down the teapot, with your name no longer on the deed. He pulled out a chair too fast and sat, arms braced on the table. This is vindictive, he said. And it's beneath you. I looked him in the eye. Is it beneath you to sleep with your son's ex-wife under my roof? He flinched. Just slightly. Then he leaned back. It wasn't planned. I let out a quiet laugh. Of course it wasn't. Things like this never are. They just happen. Like transfers to EMR partners. Like renovation estimates under someone else's last name. He looked away, the line of his jaw twitching. I should have known, he muttered. Known what? That you'd keep score. I tilted my head. I wasn't keeping score, Gerald. I was keeping receipts. Silence stretched between us. Heavy, final. He glanced toward the window. Dana was outside, pacing with her phone again. Her silhouette sharp, her movements erratic. She doesn't know, he said. Not about the trust. She didn't read the fine print, I said, echoing myself. He nodded slowly. She'll be humiliated. I sipped my tea. That's not my concern. She'll leave me. Then you'll have something in common with me. He stood. Walked once around the table, back and forth like a lawyer waiting for a closing argument to write itself. I gave you 45 years, he said, and I gave you mine. You're really going to take everything. I stood now too, slower. No, I said. Just what was always mine. Then I opened the drawer by the stove, pulled out a single envelope, and slid it across the table. He hesitated, picked it up, and saw his Internal Revenue Service whistleblower acknowledgement letter, a case number Gazenrisbratzenen, Trust 2021. His eyes scanned it. The blood drained from his face like someone had flicked a switch. You filed a report. I asked a question. I said. They're looking into the answer. This is federal, Margot. This could get ugly. It already was. You just didn't notice. His hand trembled slightly. First time I'd seen that in years. I never thought you'd go this far, he said, quieter now. I met his eyes. I never thought you would. We stood in silence again, surrounded by too many memories and not enough honesty. He finally set the letter down and pushed it slightly toward me, like maybe that would undo it. It wouldn't. I picked up my teacup. He turned to leave. Halfway through the door, he paused. What happens next? I didn't answer right away. Then I said, calmly, clearly, you move out. He didn't fight it. Didn't beg. Just closed the door behind him like he was afraid of how quietly it shut. The yelling started just after noon. I was in the garden, trimming back the last of the hydrangeas before the frost set in. The lake was still. The trees had let go of their brightest leaves, and now they stood bare and honest. Inside the house, Dana's voice cracked through the walls. You let her do this to you. Then Gerald, lower, but angry in a different way. She didn't do anything. I signed the papers. I ignored the trust. This is on me. Oh, don't you dare play the noble fool now. Dana snapped. You told me this was handled. You said she wouldn't fight. She didn't fight, he said. She planned. A pause. A slam, maybe the drawer in the hallway table. I gave up everything for you. Dana hissed. You gave up nothing, Gerald said, sharper now. You saw a vulnerable man in a strained marriage and turned it into an opportunity. I stopped pruning. Even from here, I could hear the shift, not just the words, but the weight of them. You think you're blameless in this. Dana shot back. You think she's the victim. She is, he said. You were living under her roof while sleeping with her husband. She was practically gone already. Another slam. Then silence. I walked inside slowly, not to interrupt, just to pass through. They were in the den, door wide open, their voices now hushed but cutting. Gerald sat on the edge of the couch, elbows on knees, face pale. Dana stood over him, arms crossed, eyes wild with panic. You need to fix this, she said. I can't, he replied. You as will, she spat. But even she didn't sound convinced anymore. I crossed the hallway and stepped into the kitchen. Picked up the tea kettle. Let it boil. They didn't follow me. They didn't even notice I'd passed. By the time I sat down at the kitchen table, the front door opened. Wade. He looked tired. Not in the way people look after a bad night's sleep, but the way people look when they've seen something that cracks their understanding of the world. Mom, he said, breath uneven. I just got this. He handed me his phone. It was a screenshot of a message from Sage. I didn't want to get involved, but I can't stay quiet anymore. I think you should know what Ember's been doing. Sick below it, a second message. See if I have proof. Can we talk? My hand didn't shake. I looked up at Wade. His eyes searched mine, same as when he was 6 and couldn't find his toy in the sandbox. She sent it this morning, he said. I haven't responded. I passed the phone back gently. Go call her, I said. Tell her she's welcome here. He nodded. Then, quietly, I's dad's still here. In the den? I said. He looked toward the closed door, but didn't move to open it. Instead, he took out his phone again and stepped onto the porch. I watched him go. His shoulders squarer than I remembered. His stride firmer than it used to be. Then I turned back toward the den. The voices had stopped. And for the first time, I realized Dana had finally run out of things to say. Some things collapse loud. Others just stop holding weight. And when they fall, they don't shatter. they simply disappear. The car pulled up just after 10. I'd been watching the driveway from the kitchen window, not waiting exactly, just observing, the way one watches leaves slide across the lake when the wind changes. Gerald stepped out, shoulders hunched, wearing that same brown coat he always said he hated. The one I'd bought him after his promotion. The lining had long since torn, but he never replaced it. He didn't knock. Just walked in through the side door like he had every morning for 45 years. I stayed in the kitchen, hands wrapped around my mug. A moment later, I heard drawers opening, closet doors sliding, no footsteps hurried, no voices raised. He moved like a man collecting a version of himself that had already vanished. I didn't go to him. Didn't ask where he'd go next. Didn't ask if he'd be happy. Some answers are meant to arrive on their own, in silence. Outside, the lake shimmered dully under a gray sky. The geese had mostly gone. Only a few stragglers remained, their V-shaped patterns broken and wandering. I heard him close the suitcase. Then the front door opened. He didn't slam it. Didn't pause. Just left. I didn't follow. Upstairs, Donna's voice pierced the quiet like a crack in glass. Yes, I know the check bounced, but we had a verbal. No, I'm not trying to blame you. Look, I'll call back. Just wait. She hung up hard. Then redealed. I need this remodel. It's ours now. I can cover the difference. Just, don't pull the team yet. Another pause. Don't hang up. The silence that followed was sharp. Desperate. I didn't go up to her. I didn't say a word. The house felt larger without Gerald's presence, but not emptier. Just lighter. I walked through the living room and straightened a photo frame that had tilted. Caleb's graduation. His cap crooked. Gerald's hand on his shoulder. My smile calm, unreadable. Back then, I hadn't known yet. But maybe something in me already had. In the hallway, the light from the stairwell filtered softly over the oak floors. The dust was settling. Literally. Metaphorically. Donna was still upstairs, her voice rising again. This time, pleading. I can find another lender. You said this project mattered. You said? Hello. She exhaled hard, a thud, something tossed. I walked back to the kitchen, turned off the kettle before it could whistle. Poured a second cup of tea, just because I could. The quiet in the house was no longer hollow, it was earned, and I intended to keep it that way. He knocked this time, no phone call, no text, just 3 steady knocks on the back door like he used to when he was 16 and past curfew. I opened it. Wade stood there, jacket zipped, hands in his pockets. His eyes held something heavier than confusion, not suspicion, not anger, just wait. Hey, Ma, hey, sweetheart. He stepped inside. Didn't move far, just stood in the threshold like he wasn't sure where he belonged. Dana's gone quiet, he said. I nodded. Wes? And Dad's out. Since this morning. He looked around the kitchen, like it was smaller than he remembered. Or maybe more fragile. Then he said it. Is it true? I knew what he meant. Not the whispers. Not the legalese. The truth that shatters the kind of son you raised to believe in loyalty and decency and the quiet, steady rhythm of family. I pulled out a chair, sat. He did. I poured tea for both of us, honey in his, like always. They've been involved for a while, I said. And yes, under this roof. For longer than I let on. He rubbed the back of his neck. Why didn't you tell me? I set the cup in front of him. Because telling you wouldn't have undone it. And you deserve to come to it on your own terms. He looked down at the steam rising from the mug. I feel stupid. You're not. He didn't respond. A few moments passed in the kind of silence that has nothing left to prove. Then he asked, what happens to Dad? I stirred my own tea. That's between him and his choices, I said. I don't carry his consequences anymore. Wade nodded slowly. He always said we were the kind of family that didn't break. He said a lot of things. I replied gently. He looked at me. Really looked? Then, I'm sorry, Mom. I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. You don't have anything to be sorry for. He swallowed hard, then chuckled under his breath. You really froze his accounts. I raised an eyebrow. I read the fine print. A half smile. He leaned back in the chair, exhaling like he'd been holding his breath for months. Dinner? I asked. He hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, I'd like that. I stood and moved toward the fridge, pulled out the chicken I'd been planning to roast. Same recipe he used to ask for on his birthdays, before pizza took its place. He watched me work, hands still wrapped around the tea. As I seasoned the pan, I could feel the rhythm returning. Not the same as before, but quieter, truer, the kind that stays. 1 month later, the house had settled. Not into silence, exactly, but into something softer. The air didn't carry tension anymore. Just the smell of coffee in the morning, the rustle of the newspaper, and sometimes Wade's laugh from the front steps when he stopped by on his lunch break. He came often now. At first, it was awkward. Quiet dinners where he offered to help with dishes he used to skip. Where he'd glance toward the den, now empty, and say nothing. But lately, he stayed longer, told me about work, about the budget committee, about the neighbor's dog that always barked at his mailbox. Sometimes Sage came too. Not always. But when she did, she brought pie, or soup in mason jars. She never assumed she was invited. Always rang the bell, even when Wade had already walked in ahead of her. Once, while we cleaned up, I found her folding a dish towel with careful precision. I didn't mean to be part of the story, she said. You weren't? I replied. You were the turning page. She didn't answer, but her shoulders softened. At the guest room upstairs, Caleb's old room, became something else. Not a shrine, not a storage unit, but a quiet place. I turned it into a reading room, painted the walls a pale sage green, brought in a worn wingback chair I'd found in the consignment shop downtown, hung a framed quote above the window. Rest is not idleness. Sucker some mornings. I'd sit there with a cup of chamomile and let the lake reflect across the glass. Some afternoons, I'd open my notebook and write nothing in particular. Just thoughts. One of those mornings, I wrote to Patricia, handwritten, ink on paper. I told her about the final audit, the one that confirmed EMR Partners had no legitimate operations, that Dana had quietly left town after being served, that Gerald, according to Caleb, was staying with his sister in New Jersey and trying to reflect. I told her about Wade, about Sage, about the sound of the back door creaking open at 5:45 each evening, same as it used to when Caleb was young. And at the bottom of the page I wrote, Sir Justice didn't scream, it just arrived and sat down quietly. After Thanksgiving came. Wade roasted the turkey this year. Overcooked it a little. Sage brought rolls. I made cranberry compote the way my mother used to. Just a little orange zest and too much sugar. We ate by candlelight, not because the power was out, but because it felt like we'd earned something still and kind. After dessert, Wade helped me bring in firewood. On his way out, he lingered in the doorway. Mum. Yes. I'm proud of you. I smiled. No need for that. I know, he said. But I am anyway. A winter came late. The first snow held off until mid-December. Just a soft layer one morning on the porch railing. I watched it fall from the reading chair upstairs. Didn't think about Gerald. Didn't wonder if he missed this view. Some things, once let go, don't leave a hole, they leave space. I didn't fill it with bitterness. I filled it with peace. Outside the window, the lake began to freeze along the edges. Inside, the kettle hissed gently, and somewhere in the walls of this old house, among the creaks and sighs that had once held betrayal, I felt something settle into place again. My name, my space, my story, finally mine.